All right, time to dive deep again. And today we're going to tackle the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. It seems like you guys have given us a pretty diverse set of sources this time around. Got some Wikipedia, some mythological summaries, even a YouTube video on how those wings might have actually been built. So we'll try to, sift through it all and find those golden nuggets for you.
It's a myth that's really stood the test of time. And there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it touches on those universal themes: ambition, invention, consequences of our choices. And even now, it's still getting reinterpreted in, well, frankly, fascinating ways.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, just looking at what we've got, Athenian inventors, Cretan labyrinths, wings made of feathers and beeswax, I'm not even sure where to start.
Well, I think we got to start with Daedalus himself
Right.
to really get this story. I mean, he wasn't just some random dude who thought, hey, I'm going to build wings. He was the engineer of his time in Athens, the celebrity engineer, a master craftsman, sculptor, inventor. Some sources even say he was descended from royalty, Athenian royalty.
Yeah, a real high achiever. Until it all went wrong, at least.
Yeah, tragedy is kind of baked into his story, isn't it? And it starts with his nephew. Some sources call him Perdix, others Talos or Kalos. Anyway, this nephew, he was also a brilliant inventor, maybe even more talented than Daedalus, some say.
Oh, yeah, and the YouTube video mentions this. The nephew invented the saw. Got the idea from a fish spine, of all things. Pretty creative, huh?
Absolutely. But instead of celebrating his nephew's talent, what does Daedalus do? He's consumed by jealousy. It's hubris, that classic Greek thing, excessive pride leading to a downfall. We see it all the time in these myths.
So Daedalus, in a moment of rage, throws his nephew off the Acropolis. That sets the stage for everything that follows. His exile, fleeing to Crete, and ultimately, well, Icarus's fate.
It's all connected, isn't it? And the parallels between Daedalus's crime and Icarus's fate, that's something to think about. They both want to push boundaries, go beyond limits, but that ambition, it's a double-edged sword.
So Daedalus ends up in Crete, working for King Minos, and that's where things get a little, weird with that whole wooden cow thing.
Wooden cow, yeah. Can't talk about Daedalus and Crete without it, as strange and disturbing as it is. It's important, though, to set the stage for what comes next.
It's like Greek myth bingo, right? You've got Queen Pasiphae, Minos' wife, and she falls head over heels for a bull. Not just any bull, though. We're talking a divine bull sent by Poseidon himself.
And it wasn't just like, oh, she thought he was cute. No, she was cursed to be in love with this bull.
Okay, so Daedalus, always the problem solver, right? He builds this hollow wooden cow, covers it in cowhide. You get the picture, right? So the queen can. And that's how the Minotaur is born.
Yeah, Pasiphae gives birth to Asterion, better known as the Minotaur, the guy with the head of a bull and the body of a man. Quite a combination.
And of course, who gets stuck building the labyrinth to contain this unique offspring? Daedalus.
Yeah, Daedalus. Again, we see his brilliance, right?
Yeah.
But this time, he's using it for, well, let's just say a complicated situation. That labyrinth was so complex, once you were in, escape was basically impossible.
Okay, but then Theseus shows up, Athenian hero sent to slay the Minotaur. Daedalus actually helps him escape the labyrinth too, doesn't he?
He does. He helps Ariadne, Minos' daughter. She's fallen for Theseus, so Daedalus gives her that golden thread so Theseus can find his way out after he, kills the Minotaur. Again, Daedalus is using his genius to mess with fate, and, well, it has consequences.
We've got betrayal, monster slaying, star-crossed lovers. This myth really does have it all. Helping Theseus escape, though, not the best way to stay in King Minos' good graces.
No, not at all. Sources aren't exactly clear on all the reasons, but Minos imprisons Daedalus and Icarus, maybe to protect the labyrinth's secrets, maybe as punishment for helping Pasiphae or Theseus, or maybe, a little of both.
And this is where those famous wings come in, right? Stuck with no way out, at least not through normal means, Daedalus does what he does best. Invents.
Exactly. This is where the myth really takes off, literally. He makes these wings using feathers, wax, thread, leather straps, a real work of art, all meticulously crafted together.
And you mentioned a YouTube video analyzes the wings construction. What's so special about them? Like, did Daedalus get inspiration from real tech of his time?
What's really cool is that the wings look like they're based on how birds are actually put together. The video points out how those feathers are arranged to copy how birds to get lift and control their flight. It wasn't just randomly sticking feathers together with wax. There was real thought put into making them actually work.
I mean, that's incredible. Did he do experiments? Or, like, study birds flying?
It's definitely possible. If you think about it, it shows Daedalus wasn't just some, mythical figure. He was a skilled craftsman, an engineer who probably got inspiration from observing the world around him.
Yeah, and there's so much symbolism in those wings too, right? I mean, they represent that human desire, that need to break free from limitations, to reach for the impossible.
Absolutely. The wings are like that age-old desire to escape earthly constraints, to soar above limitations. It's something that's spoken to people for centuries and still does today.
Before we get to that famous flight, though, there's this little bit of controversy about Daedalus himself. Remember how I mentioned those conflicting accounts? Well, some sources say Daedalus, maybe he wasn't actually named after the statues he made.
Ah, yeah, the chicken or egg problem.
Yeah.
Did the statues, those Daedala, get their name from this legendary craftsman? Or was Daedalus named because he was so closely associated with these incredibly lifelike statues? This makes you think, right? About how myth and history are intertwined, especially back then.
Yeah, totally. And what's really wild is that some of the sources say these Daedalus statues were actually thought to be alive, like in some way.
Right. It all ties into that whole ancient Greek idea of anima, the belief that objects could have a soul, a life force. So Daedalus's creations, they weren't just, pretty to look at. They had this sense of vitality, maybe even magic to them.
Man, that makes his talent even more impressive and maybe a little creepy too.
It definitely blurs the line between art and reality, between creator and creation, a theme we're still fascinated by even now, with AI and robots and all that.
Okay, back to the escape. Daedalus and Icarus, wings on, ready for that leap of faith. What happens next?
This is where it gets, well, really tragic. As they're getting ready to take off, Daedalus gives Icarus that famous warning, right? Stay the middle course, don't fly too high, don't fly too low.
Yeah, solid dad advice, but we all know Icarus doesn't exactly listen.
He doesn't. Full of that youthful energy, ignores his dad's warning completely. He gets swept up in that feeling of flight, the freedom, soars higher and higher, drawn to the sun like, I don't know, like a moth to a flame.
It's heartbreaking, right? Icarus's defiance. But some scholars say it's not just about a kid being reckless. How else have people interpreted his decision to, fly too close to the sun?
Some people see it as, like a metaphor, the dangers of ambition that goes unchecked. Icarus wants to outdo his dad, reach the ultimate height, but look what happens. Others see it as representing that human desire for the divine, even if it destroys us in the process.
So it's deeper than just a kid who didn't listen to his father. It's about how complex human desires are and what happens when we push too far beyond our limits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the fact that people have been telling this story for, what, thousands of years, it shows how much these themes still resonate with us.
Okay, so we all know the ending. Wax melts, wings fall apart, Icarus plunges into the sea. They even named it the Icarian Sea in his memory. But Daedalus, what about him? What was his experience?
That's a great point. We always focus on Icarus and his tragic end, but Daedalus actually achieves the impossible. He escapes and makes it all the way to Sicily, flying.
And not just a quick little hop either. Crete to Sicily, that's a serious journey, especially back then. Think of the endurance, both physical and mental, to do something like that.
Yeah, it's incredible. And we don't have like a diary entry from him or anything, about how he felt during that flight. But you can imagine, right, the mix of, I don't know, exhilaration and fear, the joy of soaring through the air, the wind, but also that horror of seeing his son fall, his own son, from the sky.
Yeah, can't even imagine that. And the guilt he must felt.
Oh, absolutely, the weight of that. Some stories say he cursed his own ingenuity, the very skills that allowed them to escape, but also led to, well, Icarus.
That's heavy. The creator, tormented by his own creation, makes you think about how innovation, human innovation, it can be a double-edged sword.
Right.
We strive to create, to push those boundaries, but what we create can have consequences we don't foresee, consequences that can be pretty terrible.
For sure. It speaks to our hubris. As humans, we think we can control nature, bend it to our will. But Daedalus, as brilliant as he was, he's humbled in the end, right? By the power of the sun, the fragility of his own invention, and that tragic loss of his son.
Okay, so Daedalus makes it to Sicily, grieving, but alive. What's next? Does he just, retire from inventing and take up pottery or something?
Not quite. He may have, metaphorically speaking, hung up his wings, but his mind, it didn't stop working. He keeps creating, building, inventing. But his work, there's a definite shift in this period.
What do you mean, like his style changes? Or he's inventing totally different kinds of things?
It's subtle, but if you look closely at what he creates in Sicily, there's a move away from the purely practical stuff, like the wings or the wooden cow. It's like he's drawn to projects with a more, I don't know, artistic spiritual side to them.
You mentioned he builds a temple to Apollo, right? What's the significance of that?
It's interesting, isn't it? After everything he's been through, the exile, the labyrinth, losing Icarus, he dedicates a temple to Apollo, the god of music, poetry, healing.
It's like he's looking for comfort or forgiveness through art, maybe trying to reconnect with some kind of harmony, some beauty after all that chaos.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And some scholars even say that Daedalus's later stuff, even the things that had a practical use, they had this artistry and symbolism woven into them that wasn't really there before in his earlier inventions.
Do you think that's because of Icarus? Like losing him? Maybe it's his way of coming to terms with his creative powers, finding a way to use them for good, after seeing how destructive they could be.
It's a compelling theory. Remember, Daedalus cursed his own art after Icarus fell. Maybe this shift was him trying to make peace with his creative side, use it for good after seeing the bad.
It adds a whole new layer to his story, right? He's not just a one-dimensional inventor. He's a complex guy, wrestling with what he's done, trying to find meaning in his work.
It reminds us that even the most brilliant minds, they still feel things deeply. Daedalus' story isn't just about achievements and inventions, it's about loss, guilt, the need to find a way to redeem himself.
Okay, so Daedalus is building temples, maybe finding some peace through art. But even in Sicily, his past isn't done with him, is it? Minos might be dead, but Daedalus is still carrying the weight of what happened.
You're right. He may be physically safe from Minos, but the memory of Icarus, that guilt, it sticks with him.
And flying. Imagine what that must have been like for him after what happened. This incredible thing he achieved, followed by such immense tragedy. Do any of the sources talk about how he felt about flying after Icarus died?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, we don't have anything directly from Daedalus himself, but if we look at his later inventions, what he was doing, maybe we can find some clues.
What do you see?
Well, one thing that stands out, he never tries to fly again. Never. He did something nobody thought possible, but he just stops.
I never thought of that, but it makes sense. The wings, they represent both his greatest triumph and his biggest regret. How could he even look at them, let alone strap them on and fly, without seeing Icarus falling?
Exactly. And maybe that's why he starts creating things that are, firmly on the ground, temples, sculptures. Maybe he needed to feel grounded, literally, after all that trauma in the air.
It makes you wonder if he regretted making those wings in the first place.
Right.
Like, was escaping worth losing his son?
That's a question that's been around forever, hasn't it? Progress, sacrifice. Is there one without the other? Is it always worth the risk to create something new? Daedalus' story makes us ask those questions even now.
So Daedalus is in Sicily, rebuilding his life, dealing with his past. Does he ever actually find peace, happiness?
Hard to say. The myths don't really go into his emotional state too much in those later years. What they do say is that he kept creating, inventing, teaching others. Some versions even say he became a respected teacher, passing on his knowledge to the next generation.
It's interesting, right? Even after all that, he doesn't give up on creating, on his passion. Maybe that was his redemption, finding a way to use his gifts to help others, to inspire them.
Maybe. And perhaps that's one of the things this story teaches us. Even in the face of tragedy, loss, there's still room for growth, for creativity, for finding meaning in life. Daedalus, he had his flaws, his grief, but he never stopped striving, never stopped creating.
It's not a happy ending exactly, but it's not all doom and gloom either. It's more complicated than that. It's about ambition, about the choices we make, and how creativity can endure even after a terrible loss.
Exactly. This myth sticks with us because it shows how complex we are as humans. We want to achieve great things, we make mistakes, we experience both joy and sorrow, and we keep creating even when it feels like everything's falling apart.
A lot to think about there. But before we wrap up our Daedalus deep dive, let's talk about the myth's lasting impact. You mentioned it's been reinterpreted throughout history. What are some specific examples?
Oh, tons. The story of Daedalus and Icarus, it's inspired artists, writers, musicians for centuries. You see it in ancient Greek pottery, Renaissance paintings, modern songs, even movies.
Bruegel's painting, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, comes to mind. It's interesting how he focuses on what all the everyday people are doing in the foreground, while Icarus falling is just this little thing in the background. What do you think he was going for with that?
It's interesting, isn't it? Some people see it as like a commentary on how the world doesn't really care about individual suffering. Life just goes on, even when bad things are happening all around us. Others think it's a reminder that even big, spectacular failures can go unnoticed. The world doesn't stop for our triumphs or our defeats.
Kind of bleak, but I get it. And it shows how universal the myth is. Different people, different times can find their own meaning in it.
Absolutely. And that's the power of it, right? It's not a fixed story with just one meaning. It changes with us, reflecting how we think about ambition, creativity, what it means to be human.
What about other retellings? What are some of the notable ones?
Well, you've got Ovid's version in the Metamorphoses, which is more about the psychology of the characters,
Oh.
all the drama. And then there's James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which uses the myth to talk about artistic ambition, the struggle to express yourself.
I've always loved how modern artists have used the myth to, explore what's going on in the world now. Like David Bowie's Is There Life on Mars? He talks about Icarus and wanting to escape from a world that feels more and more alienating. And then there's that W.H. Auden poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts. He also uses the myth to talk about how society ignores suffering.
It's wild, right, how this old story is still finding new life in contemporary art. It shows how powerful it is, how it can cross time and cultures, and still give us insights into what it means to be human, even today.
So we've gone from Athenian workshops to Cretan labyrinths, soaring flights to tragic falls. We've looked at Daedalus's character, the symbolism of those wings, and how this myth has influenced art and culture throughout history. As we start to wrap this up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
I think one big takeaway is the importance of balance. Remember Daedalus' warning to Icarus. Find that middle path, not too high, not too low. It's a message that applies to so much in life. Whether it's about your ambition, taking risks, even just finding that work-life balance. It's about avoiding extremes, finding that sweet spot where you can thrive.
Couldn't agree more. It's so easy to get carried away with something new, with chasing success. Daedalus's warning is a good reminder to be careful, to balance our excitement with some wisdom.
And don't forget about the consequences of unchecked ambition. Icarus, he wanted to fly higher and higher, get close to the sun, and we all know how that turned out. It's a cautionary tale, right, about hubris, overreaching, and not listening to those who are wiser and more experienced.
But it's not just about Icarus, is it? I mean, Daedalus's ambition is what makes him create those wings in the first place.
Hmm.
His ingenuity is what allows him to escape, but it also, in a way, leads to his son's death.
That's the point. The myth is saying that ambition, it can be both a creative force and a destructive one. It can take you far, but you have to use it responsibly. You have to be aware of the consequences.
So it's not about giving up on ambition entirely. It's about balancing it with caution, wisdom, and an understanding of the risks. And maybe also accepting that even brilliant people make mistakes, that our actions have consequences we might not always see coming.
Absolutely. And I think another big takeaway is that even when you achieve something amazing, there can still be tragedy. Daedalus achieved the impossible flight, but it came at a huge cost. It's like the myth is saying that progress isn't always a straight line. Success can come with loss. And even when you're happy, you shouldn't forget that life is fragile.
It's a powerful message, isn't it? It's like the myth is telling us, celebrate your wins, but don't get cocky, because things can change in an instant.
And speaking of change, think about how Daedalus changes in the story. At first, he's a super talented but flawed inventor, driven by pride and ambition. But after losing Icarus, he changes.
He becomes more thoughtful, more aware of how what he does affects other people.
Exactly. And even though he keeps creating, his work has a different feel to it now. There's this sense of responsibility, a need to use his skills for a better purpose, to build things that inspire and heal, instead of just wowing people or defying nature.
Makes me think about what we consider success. Is it about being famous, or is it about making a positive impact on the world, using your talents to make a difference? The way Daedalus shifts his focus, it makes you think that real fulfillment might come from combining what you're passionate about with a sense of purpose.
And that purpose can change over time, just like it did for Daedalus. He started with these amazing inventions, pushing the limits of what people thought was possible. But after that tragic loss, he shifts to making things that bring people together, that heal, that make people think.
So it's not about dropping your ambitions altogether. It's more about refining them, aligning them with your values, with what really matters to you.
Exactly. And that might even mean walking away from some goals, like Daedalus did with flying. It might mean embracing new paths that bring a different kind of satisfaction.
It's recognizing that life takes you in different directions, and sometimes you end up on a road you never expected. The important thing is to be open to those possibilities, to find ways to use what you're good at to make a positive impact, even if it's not the impact you're aiming for at first.
And that might be the most profound message of this myth, isn't it? It's not a straightforward story of winning or losing. It's more about the human experience, with all its ups and downs, our dreams, our limitations, our ability to be incredibly creative and to experience terrible loss.
It makes you think about your own ambitions, your relationship with technology, the choices you make when you're chasing your dreams.
And it reminds you that even when things are really bad, there's always hope, room to grow, to find redemption, to find meaning even when things are difficult.
So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, we want to leave you with one last thought. We've talked about Icarus flying too close to the sun, right? But what about the opposite? What about the people who fly too low, who are so scared of failing, or so scared of what might happen if they're too ambitious, that they never really reach for what they could be?
That's a really important question. Is it a different kind of tragedy? To play it safe, to hold back your creativity, to never test your limits?
What do we lose when we choose to stay on the ground, to stay within what's easy and comfortable?
Maybe we miss out on chances to grow, to discover new things, to feel the joy of pushing past what we think we're capable of, even if it means making some mistakes along the way.
So to everyone listening, we ask, what do you want to create? What dreams are you holding back on because you're afraid or unsure? What would it take for you to embrace your potential, to really spread your wings and fly?
And remember this myth, it's not just about the dangers of being reckless, it's also about how incredible human ingenuity is, our ability to imagine, to create, to push boundaries and discover new things.
So keep exploring, keep creating, and keep reaching for the sky. But do it with some balance, some wisdom, and be open to learning from your successes and your failures.
And remember, even if you don't reach the sun, the journey itself could be pretty amazing.
Okay, so Daedalus is in Sicily, finally safe from Minos, but we were saying his story doesn't end there, right?
Oh,
What
yeah.
does this newfound freedom mean for him? What's he going to do now?
Well, he's heartbroken, obviously, after losing Icarus. But he's also, got to be relieved to be free. And that inventive spirit of his, it doesn't just disappear. He reaches Sicily, and he keeps creating. But it's different now. There's a change in his work.
Different how? Like his style changes, or is he making completely new things?
It's subtle, but if we really look at what he's making in Sicily, you see a shift. He's not so focused on those practical inventions anymore, like the wings or that whole wooden cow situation. He seems more drawn to projects that have, I don't know, maybe a more artistic or spiritual bent to them.
Like building that temple to Apollo, right? You mentioned that earlier. What's the significance there?
It's a curious choice, isn't it? After all that, the exile, the labyrinth, Icarus, he dedicates a temple to Apollo, the god of music, poetry, healing. Why do you think he did that?
Maybe he was seeking some kind of solace through art, or forgiveness, trying to reconnect with beauty and harmony after so much chaos and loss.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Some scholars even suggest that Daedalus's later work, even the practical stuff, it's infused with artistry, symbolism, things that weren't really present before.
Do you think it's a direct response to Icarus's death? Like he's trying to use his creative powers for good now, after seeing how destructive they can be?
Oh, it's definitely a possibility. Remember how he cursed his own art after Icarus fell? Maybe this shift was him trying to make peace with that creative side of himself, using it for healing instead of destruction.
Yeah, it really adds another layer to his story. He's not just an inventor anymore. He's this complex figure grappling with the consequences of his actions, trying to find meaning in what he creates.
Right, and it's a good reminder that even the most brilliant minds, they're still human. They experience emotions just like everyone else. Daedalus' story, it's not just about inventions and achievements. It's about loss, guilt, and that need to redeem himself.
So he's building temples, maybe finding some peace through art. But even in Sicily, he's not completely free of his past, right? I mean, Minos might be gone, but Daedalus still has to live with what happened.
Definitely. He might be safe from Minos physically, but the memory of Icarus and all that guilt, that's not going anywhere.
And imagine what flying must have been like for him after that. This incredible thing he accomplished, but then such a terrible tragedy. Do any of the sources talk about how he felt about flying after Icarus's death?
It's an interesting thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we don't have any direct accounts from Daedalus himself, but we can look at what he did later on, the things he created, to see if there are any clues.
Okay, what do you see?
Well, the most obvious thing, he never flies again. Not once.
Yeah.
He achieved something nobody thought was possible, and then he just stops.
I never really thought about that before, but it makes perfect sense. Those wings, they became a symbol of his greatest success and his biggest failure all at once. How could he even look at them, let alone try to fly again, without reliving that horrible moment when Icarus fell?
Exactly. And maybe that's also why he started focusing on things that were, solidly on the ground. Temples, sculptures. Maybe he needed that feeling of being grounded, literally, after the trauma of flight.
It almost makes you wonder if he regretted creating those wings in the first place. Like, was escaping worth losing his son?
Now, that is a question philosophers and artists have been grappling with for ages, hasn't it? Progress, sacrifice, is there one without the other? Is the risk of creating something new always worth it? Daedalus' story makes us ask those questions even now, all these years later.
Okay, so Daedalus is in Sicily, rebuilding his life, working through all this baggage from his past. Does he ever find peace? Happiness?
It's tough to say. The myths don't really go into his feelings much during those later years, but they do make a point of saying that he continued to create, invent, teach. Some versions even say he became this respected teacher, passing his skills and knowledge on to a new generation.
That's kind of beautiful, isn't it? Even after everything, he keeps that passion for creation alive. Maybe that was his redemption, finding a way to use his gifts to benefit others, to inspire them.
Maybe so. And perhaps that's one of the things his story teaches us. Even when we face horrible tragedy, loss, there's still room for growth, for creativity, for finding meaning. Daedalus, he was flawed, he was grieving, but he never gave up. He never stopped creating.
It's not a story with a simple happy ending, but it's not hopeless either. It's more complicated than that. It's about ambition, the choices we make, and how creativity can survive even the worst kind of loss.
Exactly. And I think the reason it resonates with people, even today, is because it reflects how complex we are as humans. We want to do great things, but we mess up. We experience both joy and sorrow, and we keep creating even when it feels like everything's falling apart.
Definitely a lot to think about. But before we wrap up our Daedalus deep dive, let's circle back to how the myth has impacted the world. You mentioned it's been reinterpreted throughout history. Can you give us some specific examples of that?
Sure. The story of Daedalus and Icarus has been a source of inspiration for artists, writers, musicians for centuries. We see it everywhere. Ancient Greek pottery, Renaissance paintings, modern songs, even films.
One that always sticks with me is Bruegel's painting, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. It's fascinating how he focuses on all the everyday people doing their thing in the foreground, while Icarus falling is just this tiny detail way off in the background. What do you think he was trying to say with that?
It's interesting, right? Some people think it's a commentary on how indifferent the world can be to suffering. Like, life just goes on, even when bad things are happening around us. Others interpret it as saying that even huge dramatic failures can go unnoticed, that the world doesn't always pay attention to our wins or losses.
It's a bit bleak, I'll admit. But it does show you how universal this myth is. People from different times and cultures can find meaning in it that speaks to them.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
It's not some rigid story with just one meaning. It changes with us, reflecting how our ideas about ambition, creativity, the human condition evolve over time.
What about other retellings of the story? Any other notable ones come to mind?
Oh, for sure. There's Ovid's version in his Metamorphoses, which is really focused on the psychology of the characters, the drama of it all. And then there's James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which uses the myth to talk about artistic ambition and that struggle to express yourself, to find your voice.
I love how modern artists have used the myth to explore things that are relevant to us today, like David Bowie's song, Is There Life on Mars? He references Icarus and wanting to escape a world that feels increasingly isolating. And then there's the W.H. Auden poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts, which also uses the myth to comment on how society tends to ignore suffering.
It's amazing how this ancient story is still finding new life in contemporary art. It shows how powerful a myth can be, how it can cross boundaries of time and culture and still offer insights into the human experience that are relevant to us today.
Okay, so we've journeyed from Athenian workshops to Cretan labyrinths, from soaring flights to tragic falls. We've unpacked Daedalus's character, the symbolism of those wings, and how the myth has influenced art and culture throughout history. As we get ready for our final thoughts on this deep dive, what are some of the key things our listeners should be taking away from all this? What should they be thinking about?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of balance. Remember Daedalus's warning to Icarus. Find that middle path, not too high, not too low. It's advice that applies to so much in life, right? Whether it's about ambition, taking risks, even just finding that work-life balance. It's about avoiding extremes, finding that sweet spot where you can thrive.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in chasing after a new goal, to get blinded by the promise of success. Daedalus's warning is a good reminder to proceed with caution, to temper that excitement with a bit of wisdom.
And let's not forget the consequences of unchecked ambition. Icarus, he wanted to fly higher and higher, to get as close to the sun as possible. And we all know what happened there. It's a cautionary tale, right? About hubris, about overreaching, and about failing to heed the advice of those who are wiser and more experienced.
But it's not just about Icarus, right? Daedalus's own ambition is what leads him to create the wings in the first place. His ingenuity helps them escape, but it also indirectly leads to his son's death.
Exactly. The myth is trying to tell us something about ambition. It can be a force for creativity, but it can also be destructive. It can push you to achieve amazing things, but it has to be tempered with responsibility and awareness of the potential consequences.
So it's not about squashing ambition entirely. It's more about learning to balance it with caution, wisdom, and a healthy dose of understanding the risks involved. And maybe also accepting that even brilliant people make mistakes, and those mistakes can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And I think another crucial takeaway is this. Even when you achieve something incredible, there can still be tragedy. Daedalus achieved something that was considered impossible. He flew. But it came at a horrible price. It's like the myth is saying, hey, progress isn't always a smooth ride. Success can be intertwined with loss. And even in moments of joy, it's important to remember how fragile life is.
It's a powerful message, isn't it? Celebrate those achievements, but stay humble, because things can change in an instant.
And on the topic of change, let's think about how Daedalus himself changes over the course of the story. At first, he's this brilliant but flawed inventor, driven by pride and ambition. But after losing Icarus, he's different.
He becomes more introspective, right? More mindful of the potential impact of his actions.
Exactly. And while he never stops creating, his work takes on a new dimension. There's this sense of responsibility now, a desire to use his gifts for something bigger than himself, to create things that inspire and heal rather than just amaze people or define nature.
Makes you think about how we define success. Is it about fame and recognition, or is it about using your talents to make a positive difference in the world? The way Daedalus changes his focus suggests that maybe real fulfillment comes from aligning your passions with a sense of purpose.
And that purpose can evolve over time, just like it did for Daedalus. He started out creating these incredible inventions, pushing the boundaries of what people thought was possible. But after experiencing such a tragic loss, he shifts his attention to creating things that bring people together, that offer healing and encourage reflection.
So it's not about abandoning your ambitions, it's about refining them, about finding ways to make sure they align with your values, with what truly matters to you.
Absolutely. And that might mean stepping back from some goals like Daedalus did with flying and finding new paths that offer a different kind of fulfillment.
It's about recognizing that life is a journey, and sometimes the path we think we're on takes an unexpected turn. The key is to be open to those new possibilities, to find ways to use our talents to make a positive impact, even if it's not the impact we originally envisioned.
You know, that shift Daedalus makes from practical inventions to more artistic pursuits, it makes me wonder about something. We often talk about STEM fields, science and technology and engineering and math, as separate from the arts. But Daedalus's story seems to blur that line, showing that creativity and innovation can happen in both areas.
That's a great point. It's a good reminder that those fields aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they often work really well together, each one making the other stronger. Think about it. Daedalus used his understanding of engineering and aerodynamics to create the wings. But he also incorporates artistic elements, like how he arranged the feathers and used wax as a binding agent. It's a combination of technical skill and aesthetic sensibility.
And in his later work, like the Temple to Apollo, you see that blend again. Architectural knowledge combined with an understanding of symbolism and spirituality. He's not just building a structure, he's creating a work of art that reflects his personal journey and the complexities of the human experience.
I wonder if Daedalus's story can inspire us to rethink how we approach education and creativity. Maybe we should be encouraging more collaboration between STEM fields and the arts, recognizing that real innovation often happens when different disciplines come together.
I couldn't agree more. If we break down those artificial barriers between fields, who knows what we could create? Imagine if we encourage students to explore the links between science and art, between engineering and music, between math and literature.
Now that's an exciting thought. I can already picture a future where engineers are also poets and mathematicians are also dancers.
And maybe that's Daedalus's ultimate legacy. He reminds us that creativity knows no bounds, that the human spirit can soar to incredible heights, and that even in the face of tragedy, even when we experience loss, we can still find ways to use our gifts to make the world a more beautiful, more meaningful place.
Wow, that's a great note to end on. But we've got one more part to this deep dive. Let's take a quick break and come back for our final thoughts.
Okay, so we're back, ready for our final thoughts on Daedalus and Icarus. We've talked about his inventions, his ambition, his tragic loss. But what does it all mean for us today? Like, how could we actually apply the lessons of this ancient myth to our own lives? It's a good question. How do you take these old stories and make them relevant to, the 21st century? Well, one thing Daedalus and Icarus really highlights is that idea of balance. Daedalus warned Icarus, find that middle path, not too high, not too low.
And that applies to so much in life, right? Ambition, taking risks, even just trying to balance work and life. It's about finding that sweet spot, not going to extremes.
It's about recognizing that even a good thing, too much of it can be bad. Icarus wanted to reach the sun, right? Unbridled ambition. And we all know how that ended.
It's easy to get caught up in chasing our goals, you know? Like, we get so focused on success that we forget to be careful. Daedalus's story, it's a good reminder to balance our enthusiasm with a bit of caution.
And to remember that, well, progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes taking a risk means you'll have setbacks. You might even fail. But those failures, they can teach you something valuable. They give you a chance to grow, to adjust your course.
It's about embracing the journey with all its ups and downs, not just focusing on the end goal.
And speaking of journeys, it's interesting to think about Daedalus's own transformation throughout this story. He starts out ambitious, maybe even a little arrogant, a brilliant inventor, sure, but responsible for both amazing creations and, well, terrible tragedies. But after losing Icarus, something shifts in him.
He becomes more aware of himself, of how his actions affect others.
Yeah, exactly. And he never stops creating, but his work takes on a new meaning. You can sense the responsibility there, the need to use his gifts for something more, something good, to create things that heal and inspire rather than just, shocking people or trying to conquer nature.
Makes me think about what we even consider success. Is it about being famous? Or is it more about using what you're good at to make a positive impact on the world? The way Daedalus shifts his focus, it makes you think that maybe real fulfillment comes from finding that purpose, something that's meaningful to you.
And that purpose, it can change, just like Daedalus's did. At first, he's all about these incredible inventions, pushing the limits of what people thought was possible. But after such a devastating loss, he starts focusing on things that bring people together, that heal, that encourage them to think.
So maybe it's not about giving up on our dreams entirely. Maybe it's more about refining them, making sure they line up with our values, with what we really care about.
Exactly. And sometimes that means taking a step back from certain goals, like Daedalus did with flying. It might mean trying new things, finding new paths that lead to a different kind of satisfaction.
It's about understanding that life is full of twists and turns. Sometimes we end up on a path we never planned on taking. The important thing is to be open to those new possibilities, to find ways to use our talents to make a positive impact, even if it's different from what we imagined at first.
Right. And maybe that's the most important takeaway from this whole myth. It's not just this story about success or failure. It's a look at the human experience, with all its contradictions and challenges, our hopes, our limits, our ability to create incredible things, and also to experience incredible loss.
It definitely makes you think about your own ambitions, your relationship with technology, the choices you make when you're trying to achieve your dreams.
And it reminds us that even when things are really tough, even when we go through terrible things, there's always hope. There's always the possibility of growth, of redemption, of finding meaning, even in the middle of life's challenges.
That's a great point. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Daedalus and Icarus, we want to leave you with one final thought. We've talked about Icarus flying too close to the sun, right? But what about the people who fly too low? The ones who are so afraid of failing, so afraid of what might happen if they're too ambitious, that they never really reach for their full potential.
It's an interesting question to think about. Is there a different kind of tragedy in playing it safe? In holding back our creativity? In never testing our limits?
What do we miss out on when we choose to stay grounded, to stick with what's comfortable and familiar?
Maybe we miss out on chances to grow, to discover new things, to feel the joy of pushing past what we think we're capable of, even if it means making mistakes along the way.
So, to our listeners, we ask you this. What are you passionate about? What are those dreams you've been holding back on because you're afraid or unsure? What would it take for you to really embrace what you're capable of, to spread your wings and fly?
And remember, the story of Daedalus and Icarus, It's not just a warning against being reckless. It's also about celebrating human ingenuity, our ability to imagine, to create, to push those boundaries and explore new possibilities.
So keep exploring, keep creating, keep reaching for the sky. But do it with balance, with wisdom, and be open to learning from both your successes and your failures.
And remember, even if you don't quite reach the sun, the journey itself can be pretty amazing.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.